Alright, so does anyone remember White Noise with Michael Keaton from like 2005, I think it was? I only really remember it because it came out at like the very beginning of January and there was like a massive snowstorm the night that I saw it. Honestly, if it wasn't for that, I probably wouldn't remember much of anything about this movie's existence. Which is weird because it does actually have a whole legacy where it became a trend where horror movies were coming out at the beginning of January and being surprisingly successful. And apparently, this was the start of that, where it came out, and even though like nobody liked it, like critics and audiences didn't really seem to care for it, and it was very forgotten very fast. It was still really successful. It was like a 10 million budget, and it made like over 90 million, despite all of that. And then that's where the trend started, apparently, of releasing these horror movies in January that became a whole thing. So, as far as the movie itself, I did revisit it recently, just really out of curiosity, before I was going to do this whole thing, this whole video series. And it's still pretty forgettable. It's got an interesting enough concept, and it's got, performances by Michael Keaton, and Ian McNeice especially is really good in it. But it gets really sort of, I don't know if you want to say incoherent, but it gets all over the place very quickly also, and as its concept starts to open up new doors, that's something that could have been pretty interesting, but it just feels like it's just all over the damn place and has no idea what it's trying to do, and it's got that very, very underwhelming climax, where it's like, oh, it was actually this guy we saw like once when Keaton was stepping out of an elevator, and it's and the effects of the ghosts are like really cheesy. It's like what you would see in like a YouTube video or something, like a YouTube video circa close to when this movie actually came out. Like in the 2007 or 2008 era of YouTube, you'd find an effect that looks like the ghosts in this movie. And the whole idea of like killing off Keaton's character just for the sake of having the ending where he talks to his son through the radio. It just doesn't really amount to much of anything and is very insignificant, except for that part that it played in January release schedules for horror movies, apparently. So you can imagine expectations are low when a straight to DVD sequel comes out for a movie like this. But every now, it's very, very rare, but every now and then we'll have that movie like Annabelle comes on, not Annabelle comes on, Annabelle Creation was the really good one that followed the kind of shitty Annabelle movie. Or when Ouija Origin of Evil came out, when everybody had forgotten Ouija long ago. Um, this is kind of what these two did, where it's like nobody really remembers or cares about the Keaton movie, believe it or not. But this straight to DVD sequel with Nathan Fillion and Katie Sackhoff, that's the one that was kind of like, okay, I saw what that movie was trying to do, so let's actually try to make that work. Let's take the part. You would think it would be, oh, let's take the most interesting part and expand on that, but to me, they took the part where the first movie was kind of going off the rails, where it was like it was trying to suddenly be a whole other thing entirely, quite suddenly. And so, taking that, the idea of it being acting as sort of a premonition and you being able to save lives, and then let's expand on that. And it essentially becomes like Nathan Fillion's Unbreakable for a little bit. And so that is a good way to go and a good way to start on this. Like we talked about with the Descent sequel, this was a movie that was in theaters internationally, but here in the U.S., it went straight to DVD. I think they even released it straight to DVD in January, almost like they were still trying to capitalize on what the first movie did, in the straight to DVD market. But it's also worth noting that on this, everywhere on this DVD, and when you watch the actual movie, on this version, it just says White Noise 2, and that's all it is. But apparently, White Noise The Light is another title for it, which also makes sense when you see the plot. But yeah, I only know it as just White Noise 2 with no subtitle, so any confusion on that is that. So it opens immediately with this in this very tragic and mysterious way, where we see Nathan Fillion with his wife and son, and everything's happy. And like the first movie, you know it's gonna get tragic pretty soon. But while the first movie took like 10 or 15 minutes to set all that up, this one, just right in its opening scene, has a guy come in and just shoots his wife and son in front of him in public before turning the gun on himself. And that's a very that's something that's going to grab you immediately. And what's great about this movie is the way it sort of keeps the mystery about it, where that seems like such a, like he even says like, oh, it's just so random, but we know, as viewers, that it's not going to be so random. But movies like this tend to be a bit predictable, so I find it really refreshing the way this movie plays out its events, to where you're kind of constantly asking questions of like how and why, and even when you start to figure out, okay, I see where it's going, you're still always asking questions of, but I'm curious what the explanation for that is going to be, because that's something I haven't figured out yet. Or how it got to that point, or what happened with the wife and son previously, before the movie started, that's going to tie into all this that's going on later, because it does add a new factor into this, where Fillion's character shortly after tries to kill himself, and he's revived, so he has that near-death experience where he was there, so when he comes back with that, he now has this power of seeing the light around these people who are close to death, and then he can save their lives. And then, just when you settle in and think, like I was saying, it's going to be Nathan Fillion's Unbreakable, essentially, then they kind of throw another twist into it. So that's something that's... And they kind of, right away, are setting things up and then kind of throw you off in this really good way. Like when we're introduced to the Doctor, and you think it's just going to be like typically it would be, oh, you're trying to explain something to the Doctor, but the Doctor thinks you're crazy or whatever. But in this case, the Doctor is the one. He's like the Ian McNeice character in the first movie, where he's all about this. He's like surrounded by monitors like that and does the whole thing. Has fallen into the obsession of the EVP thing. And then just when you think, like, the thing about the Ian McNeice character in the first movie is they set him up, and you think he's going to be like one of the main characters, but then like just as he's pretty much established everything that's going on here, like half an hour into the movie, he's dead, never to be seen again. And so the Doctor's kind of treated in the same way, but it throws even more of a curveball, because it's still right at the very beginning when the Doctor dies. Like, he sets himself up like, oh, dude, I know all about this, I'm gonna, take you through all this. And that's the last time we see him. In the next scene, he's dead already. So it's like it's setting up kind of what you know from the first movie, but also kind of stepping away quite a bit from the first one. Like, it's often considered a standalone movie. But I like the fact that even as a standalone movie, it's still taking these little elements you might recognize from the first movie and kind of intentionally pushing you in another direction to kind of toy with your expectations a little bit, which is really fun. And so, speaking of toying with expectations, there is a lot of interesting moments here of the hero not quite reaching his objectives. Like, there's a lot of failed attempts in this movie by the hero of the story, and that's something that I find really fascinating also, because, well, I do like when he first comes out, and of course we're going to have the disorienting, phase, where he's just getting used to this, he's hearing the voices, he's hearing the radios, and I like the effect of like all the sounds being heightened. And of course we're going to have, jump scares throughout it, which aren't that effective. Like some of them give me vibes of kind of like the scares in Stir of Echoes a little bit, and I feel like there's sort of a connection to that movie and how it feels it's approaching, its general style of horror, and how it treats the ghosts and how to use those scares. But building him up as he's going to be the one that takes all this and is able to progressively figure it out as he goes, typically there's one failure period where it's like, oh no, I failed at doing this and I need to redeem myself, and then that's what the rest of the movie is. He has peaks and valleys through the whole movie of when he succeeds and when he fails. which I find really interesting. And it kind of almost sets it in this sort of grounded reality despite the supernatural elements. Where it's like, he figures out that he can save people because he knows when they're going to die. But the first time he tries it is the guy in front of the train who he can't save. But then it almost becomes a feel-good movie for a while when he starts to successfully save people. He saves Katie Sackhoff from her attacker, and he saves the guy on the bridge that's getting attacked. And there's the nice moment where he credits his wife and son. He looks at their picture and he's like, you saved a life, instead of saying he saved a life. And it becomes this really just feel-good aspect of the movie. And then it takes that dark turn, which I really appreciate, where it turns out that him saving people may not be the good thing it set itself up as, because everybody that gets saved ultimately ends up causing a tragedy. And so, looking at it from that perspective, the fact that you're always waiting for the other shoe to drop now whenever something happy happens in this movie, and that's going to set you on edge for the entire second half of it. There's even, when you look at his and Sagoff's relationship throughout the movie, you think, oh, this is the part where they shoehorn in a romance, like every movie does, and it's pointless and we don't give a shit. But there's a couple of things that are great about this. Is number one, they just kind of have a pretty natural chemistry, and the fact that both characters are coming from, having lost their family, where she lost her fiancé or husband, and he lost his wife and son, as we know. So there's already this sort of connection here. So the moment when she brings over, the cheap wine and stuff like that, it all feels actually natural, and you want them to find happiness again with each other, which makes it all the more tragic when this movie goes in the directions that it does, that it sets up pretty perfectly, especially when it comes to what this particular romance is leading to. It does get a little convoluted, I guess, in the middle there when it's talking about, doing things in threes, and it gets very number 23 there for a little bit. But it's also, it does bring in religion to the horror aspect in a way that's not, that's fine. When this one starts to branch off into its other ideas and open new doors, it does it much more smoothly and naturally than the first movie does. Everything in the first movie, the new turns felt very abrupt and oh, I guess we're doing this now. But there's no real seamless transitions. But in this one, it all kind of starts to tie everything together pretty nicely. And it also helps that the ghosts are much better formed in this one, where they look like fully formed people, and the way they appear and stuff like that. It's weird that the straight-to-DVD movie looks a lot better than the pretty successful theatrical release, starring Michael Keaton. But I know Michael Keaton wasn't in the place then that he is now. He was kind of in a, I guess you could call it a slump period, but still, it seems like the first movie should be much more, the production value should be much higher, regardless. But I would say they definitely are more on this one, especially with how the ghosts look, and some of the more effective moments, like the scene when he's the guy that shot his family when he's in his house, and all the monitors are covered in sheets, and those sheets just start to pull themselves off one at a time as they all sort of take over, and there's some really eerie good moments in this. While the big scares don't maybe necessarily work in the way they should, it's just the eeriness of what's going on that works, and that's can often be much more effective than trying to go big. So when you look at what I was talking about with his failures with the guy with the train, and the fact that everything sort of happens in threes, what I actually like about this also is that we get to a point where he does fail to prevent a tragedy a second time when the piano falls, when the guy on the bridge comes back. And so, at that point, it really feels like anything could happen, and this could go in any sort of tragic direction, and the hero is not, unstoppable once he figures out what's going on, like a typical hero in this kind of movie would be, usually. But I like the sort of theme of that, where he actually does fail his mission again for a third time, and that third failure, when he doesn't kill Katie Sackhoff in time, is what results in his death. And so, and of course, he is able to fix that once he's died, and that's our sort of big climax. And it's a good climax, for the most part. The one thing that kind of gets to me a little bit is that it did feel like it was setting itself up for something more interesting than it ultimately became. When you look at the mystery element, and like when you're sort of like I was talking about, where you're really, asking questions and wondering how to, like, I think I know where this is going, but I don't know how we're going to get there, and that's what's keeping me in this movie, keeping me really intrigued by all this and its mystery. So it's like once you figure out that the people that get saved always end up causing other tragedies, and that's why his wife and son were killed, especially because they were the third one. It's the idea of, okay, so what was going to happen with them? Like, what were they going to cause? And that's a question, because you figure it out around the time he figures it out, that that's what happens, is like, they've been saved, so now something tragic is going to happen because of them. There's a while in the movie where we get to ask the question of ourselves, like, what? So what was going to happen? And the question is, since they're dead and we can't go back in time, and there's really no way to dive into this, how are we ever going to know what they would have caused? And that's a question that really keeps you going until the climax of, I really want to know what the answers to this are. Like, there's times where ambiguity is fine and just running with it is fine. But then there's those movies that are really interesting where you can't wait to find out what the answers are. And that's something that's not often in horror, because horror tends to drop the ball with that that sort of thing quite a bit. It usually ends up being something very simple, and that's basically what happened here. It's a possession thing. That feels pretty underwhelming. After those questions kept us going to the end. But yeah, when you're the third, you, I guess, get possessed. So it was what was about to happen. We saw it starting to happen with his wife and son. We just didn't know what it was at the time. And then it starts to happen to Katie Sackhoff, but he's able to prevent that. And that's, our movie just ends like right there. So there's not a lot of fat on this movie, which is great. That final ending, that final last scene with the guy that killed his wife and son, I don't really know that was necessary. It's like a 10-second scene, and it's like, because he went on the same journey as Fillion did, and so we understand what was going on. So it's interesting to me that Fillion gets his happy ending, going into the light with his wife and child, and this guy is apparently going to be tortured by the ghosts, I guess. I don't really know what the point of that is, but yeah, that's pretty much how I feel about this one. So I was surprised. I didn't know going into it that it was like critically acclaimed and like people actually like this one. So I was just like, Nathan Fillion was kind of a clue, because it was sort of like, I don't think Nathan Fillion does a lot of shit. I don't like whenever I see, like, I'm sure it's out there, but I'm struggling to remember something with Nathan Fillion in it that was shit. So that's, yeah, so there's clues in there, and yeah, yeah, it's really not, especially for a straight to DVD sequel. It is definitely a step up from the first movie, which is just it's a forgettable January. It's not just a forgettable January horror movie. It's apparently the forgettable January horror movie that started the whole January horror movie thing. So what a weird legacy White Noise has that I never would have thought of before doing this. So, yeah, even when I get burnt out on doing these videos and stuff like that, I still like doing them at times because of reveals like this I never would have known. Like, there's no other reason I probably would have ever revisited White Noise if I wasn't doing, like, this kind of thing. So, so yeah, that's where I stand on this White Noise journey. So we're still trying to get caught up a little bit. We're going to. I fucked my back up a little bit, so I'm going a little slower, but we're gonna get there. We got some big video coming in regards to the 2024 horror releases that we haven't talked about yet. Which, if you've been keeping track of horror in 2024, there's a lot. And I'm gonna do a series in the next, few videos, and we've got our Oscar predictions. That's going out like today or tomorrow, depending on when you're seeing this, like right around this time. So and all that other stuff we're doing. So until the next thing, that's it.